That was very kind, Corby. I appreciate it. And thank you, Congresswoman and farmer Chellie Pingree, for being here. There was one thing that you did not mention in the bio, which I will bring up, and that is that Congresswoman Pingree serves on the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture, which sounds wonky, and it is. But and one thing to know about appropriations, they fund things. And they'll say they never legislate. They're not supposed to legislate. But because Congress is so dysfunctional, the funding bills, that's actually where a lot of the policy happens. So the Appropriations Committee, upon which Congresswoman Pingree serves, is actually a very important policy-making panel. And so a lot of the food and ag policy debates are happening there. So it's an important thing to watch. It kind of passes over people like, oh, spending bills, that sounds boring. But that really is where a lot of the action is these days. So I'm going to start out with, I want to hear a little bit more about your farm, because I think it's, maybe a lot of people don't know that you have a farm. And I want to know, are you friends with the other farmers in Congress? Is there like a special club of farmers? How many of them are there? I mean, because it seems like a unique, you bring a unique background to this
Great.
Discussion.
Well, thank you. It's fun to be able to have this conversation with you, and I echo Corby, you and Jerry. Give us all the inside scoop, even when we're in Congress. We have to find out what you guys know to make sure we know it. So I've been interested in food and organic farming for over 40 years. Just in a brief way, I was, back in the 1970s, I was one of those kind of hippie back-to-the-landers who came to Maine and started doing a little sustainable farming, but was lucky enough to go to College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, where one of my teachers was Elliot Coleman, and Elliot's he's one of the seniors in the organic farming movement, and really I could say I learned almost everything I needed to know from Elliot. So I've been farming on and off over the last 40 years. I had a small sustainable farm in the early days.
Doing knitting wool at some point.
And I used to sell knitting kits. I used to raise sheep, but I had 3 dairy cows, 100 chickens, and a couple of acres of vegetables. So I've had a diverse farm in my past. I was in the knitting business for a while. And then about 10 years ago, I got a chance to do this all over again. So now I run a slightly larger operation on the island of North Haven, which is about an hour by ferry off the coast of Maine. And we raise a few acres of vegetables because it's very cool on the coast of Maine. We do a lot of our production in hoop houses to extend the season because our customers are there in July and August. And if you gave a tomato its own chance to decide when to ripen, it would ripen in September. So we have to encourage it to start a little early. We also have 3 heated greenhouses, which we heat with wood that we harvest on the property. So we are organically certified. We raise a handful of pigs, about 30 every summer. We've raised up to 1,200 chickens and have our own processing facility, which is a nice word for slaughter. And then we have a handful, just 3 or 4 dairy cows, 2 or 3 right now, and we make cheese and yogurt. So it's a very diverse farm. Our largest market on our own farm is a restaurant that we run for the summer, so we serve up to 250 customers a night in our restaurant, so that takes up a lot of the food. And then we have 2 days of a farm stand and 1 day of a farmer's market. And 2 nights a week, we open up our barn to do a barn dinner where people can come and have the ultimate farm-to-table experience. So the nice thing about all this is that now being a member of Congress, when we're debating all of these things, I have a understanding based on many years of experience of what I have learned about farming, what composting is, what raising animals is. I like to tell my colleagues, because we have a poultry processing facility on our farm, I'm an excellent eviscerator. Got to have some skills. And also just, what some of the challenges are that people are facing, whether it's FSMA and the new rules about food safety or how to deal with these markets, and also what the huge growth in these markets has been over the years. So as to your other question, as far as I know, there are 3 organic farmers in Congress. One is John Tester, who's a dryland lentil and, I think, wheat farmer. And Mike Thompson in California has some organic grapes and olives. And we chat a little bit about issues. There are other farmers, but tend to be more conventional farmers, or they're part of a family farming operation. And we do talk on the Ag Committee or the Ag Approps Committee, but sometimes we see each other in different ways because I'm much more of an advocate for organic farming and diversified farming and many of the kinds of farming that's going on in the Northeast, but also all around the country. and sometimes they're on the other side of how the regulations should be implemented and where the money should go. So
You have differences of opinion on that.
we occasionally have differences of opinion,
Yeah.
but we have a certain kind of, I think, very strong respect for each other, because it's not easy to make money on a farm, no matter how small or big you are, and it's always a lot of work, whether it's you or your family or your employees doing it.
So when you showed up to Congress in 2009, what surprised you, or I guess what was your observation about both the interest in food and ag policy and just the conversation that was happening, and how has it changed to today? It seems like there's been a lot more interest, but are your colleagues coming up to you who are not farmers, who are maybe not even from agriculture districts, asking you about this, or how has it evolved?
Absolutely. I can say that I was literally shocked when I got to Congress. I was elected in 2008. I'd served as a state legislator in the 90s and had been on an agricultural committee then. So I had some experience in this, but when I came in 2008, and I was very interested, I'm interested in farming. I have worked on these kinds of issues all my life, and I had seen this amazing beginnings of a turnaround in interest on the part of the public and consumer in buying more organic or sustainably grown food or locally grown food. And I got
especially in your neck of the woods. There's been a lot more growth, I think.
In New England, yeah. And a real interest in the region being able to grow more of its food. So anyway, I know something about serving in a legislative body, having been in a state legislature, that people kind of own turf. There's, you're the person who knows a lot about Homeland Security, and you know a lot about healthcare policy. And I had done a lot of healthcare policy work, so I thought, well, I'll just come and work on that. And then I found that there were 35 people lined up who already were experts in this and very interested in it. But on the ag side and on these issues, which are so popular with the public, nobody seemed to be involved. And certainly nobody who had
involved in changing kind of the status quo or talking about.
Yeah, or introducing bills around it, or working on the farm bill. The ag committee was sort of a place where you got posted if you were representing a certain kind of commodity group, if you grew corn in your district or cotton. But nobody wanted to go there to kind of advocate for the consumer, except for a few of my colleagues who are concerned about SNAP benefits, the food stamp program. So I just was like, whoa, what a great gift. Like, I want to talk about these issues. The public is interested in them. And I have to say, I really got an incredible opportunity to do it. And there's great interest on the part of my colleagues. And I would say it's one of the nice issues that's not partisan. And a lot of the colleagues that I have who are not at all involved in agriculture have the consumers in their district who are interested in organic milk or buying more food locally, or being able to buy at a farmer's market, or frankly, in making sure that people of all economic backgrounds can have access to healthy food. So we usually find a lot of interest in all of these topics, and as I said, many of them are very bipartisan. They tend to be more a struggle between what region you're in and some of those issues.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, because I think in some instances, the left and the right kind of meet over food. And I mean, there's some issues, local food being one of them, raw milk sometimes can be one of them, even like legalizing hemp, industrial hemp is one of them. There's these certain, what are there issues that you've found, maybe food waste, I don't know how many of you caught the discussion before, maybe food waste, can you name a couple other issues that you found are particularly easy to find common ground between, across the aisle, even during a time when that is harder to do?
Well, I co-sponsor, or I'm the prime sponsor of two bills with Representative Massey, who is a very socially conservative, very conservative Republican, but a little bit of a libertarian. One is around taking raw milk across a state line.
Does he have a farm? No, but he's in rural Kentucky.
Yes, he has a sort of a family sustainability kind of farm. And the other is about making more availability of slaughterhouses, which is a big problem because part of the challenge of the growth in small farms and medium-sized farms is we've lost a lot of our infrastructure over the last 50 years as we've consolidated farms and everything's grown in a big feedlot or a big CAFO and goes to a feedlot and then goes to a big slaughterhouse somewhere that's centralized. Well, now we're trying to get back to this idea that there would be small slaughterhouses and you could buy something that was locally grown but also the farmer can afford to have it slaughtered.
Right, that you have the infrastructure to do that.
So the point is, he and I are co-sponsors of those, and it comes from much more of a libertarian side. This used to be Ron Paul's bill. It's sort of like, nobody's going to tell me how to drink my milk. And I come from one of those states, Maine, where not only do we have a lot of people who have been working in organic farming for a long time, but we have what's called the food sovereignty movement. So many municipalities in our state have actually passed laws at their town meeting, because we still have town meeting form of government, that basically say, no one can tell us in this town how to regulate our food. That's a little harder to stand up in court, but it's a way of emphasizing, if you want to make some jam in your kitchen and then sell it on a table in front of your house, you shouldn't be hauled to jail for doing that. And it's a kind of way of looking at this that doesn't always go well with the people who come from big farming states or represent farming food processors.
It totally does not go along party lines at all.
Absolutely not. So that's one area. Another I would say is that some of the big, more conservative policy think tanks like the Cato or others have been opposed to farm subsidies. So you'll get Ron Kind, a Democrat from Wisconsin, supporting amendments on the floor that say, well, if you receive a subsidy through the Farm Bill of, for your corn or wheat crop, you should have a cap on what your farm income is. This should be kind of like a means testing. Well, he'll get support from people on the other side where the Cato Institute will say, well, there should be no government intervention in farming. It should be all free market. And so that's another kind of interesting parallel. And then just really there's a lot of middle-of-the-road stuff. I was on the committee with a representative from Nebraska who was supporting some local food provisions and more enhancement of farmers markets and things like that. And he said, I have a district in Nebraska that raises more beef than anywhere else in the country, but I also know that many of the farmers I represent are putting in a couple of acres of tomatoes, heirloom tomatoes maybe, that they're selling to local restaurants, and they're making some good money on that. So there's been an evolution of where do farmers make money. I mean, I think at a lot of places you'd find more and more farmers that would want to convert to organic if the transition wasn't so complicated or expensive, or they had some reassurance in the market. And that's a real opportunity because you'll probably hear from some of the food processors and retailers, there's a great shortage of supply.
Yeah.
And that is increasingly, a lot of this is no longer being driven by, environmental concerns or health concerns or ideology. It's now, there is an enormous market out there, about $40 billion, and all the growth right now in retailing is in organically grown,
that's the
sustainable
fastest growing
foods.
by far in the entire, And so you mentioned organic shortages. I think this is something a lot of people aren't aware of, that there is a huge problem meeting the demand for organic. I know that you recently were part of a delegation that went to Cuba and sort of had this conversation about where Cuba could maybe fit into. There are a lot of issues, but maybe supplying some organic products to the U.S. Where do you see that conversation going? What was that trip like? And do you think that it could alleviate some of those supply concerns? It's pretty,
well,
small. It's close by, but it's a small.
Right. It's sort of a two-part question. So everybody wants to go to Cuba, right? I mean, it's a fascinating moment in time, and it's a very interesting study in a country that, we've had such an oppositional relationship with them for so long, which for the most part, the American public is still kind of scratching their head. As a diplomat said to me, if we applied some of the same standards to why we can't have trade with Cuba to countries around the world, there'd be about 55 others, including probably Vietnam and China and a lot of other places we have diplomatic and trade relationships with, but Cuba has been cut off, and so there's great fascination for it, and of course everybody wants to go there and get a ride in a 1950s car.
Was that cool? Did you do that?
Yeah, it was very cool,
Okay.
But I went down with a group, really interesting group of people, mostly in the retail business, who are concerned with this issue of supply. You've got what was once a very big agricultural country, and now they're looking for really more in the cash economy. And part of the reason we were interested in it is there's been a lot of congressional delegations and trips that have been going since the administration wonderfully opened up as much as they could under executive, their executive opportunities. So as they've opened up, you've had a lot of agricultural interests in Cuba, and we wanted to take a group of people who are very interested in organic farming, because Cuba has been pretty much organic since they lost their relationship with Russia. They didn't have the subsidies anymore. Russia was no longer, the fall of the Iron Curtain and all those things made it possible.
They had to adapt.
They had to
yeah.
adapt. They didn't have a source of chemical fertilizer, and they didn't have a big market anymore. So it's a big, complicated, long story, but they pride themselves on being a pretty much organic country, and we wanted to have people down there to say, hey, there are purchasers from the United States who would be thrilled to get a Cuban product to be able to sell here. We're 90 miles away, and we would both like to sell you some of our products and purchase yours back. And the cachet of a retailer now having Cuban grown, I see. Nestle's just caught on, and Nespresso is going to have a Cuban coffee. Well, everybody's going to want to.
There's probably a good premium in there for that.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but mostly we wanted to have the government get the message that before you go back to a sugar plantation and sell out to somebody who says, we'll send you chemical fertilizer and pesticides, you should know that there's a premium market out there interested in it. So that was a wonderful trip. But I do want to say, my primary interest is that more American farmers should be able to supply this growing demand for organic, everything from tomatoes to corn to wheat. And there are shortages out there, particularly in a lot of the kinds of commodities. So, companies are going to South Africa, to Canada. There'll be more increases in purchasing in China. And we're not so sure. I think it's harder to regulate that it's actually organically grown. Organic certification in this country is very tight and very regulated. I know, I'm a certified organic farmer, and those are not easy standards to meet, and nobody lets you off the hook for them.
Right.
So, and why aren't our farmers getting this market? You get a premium price. And so one of my big issues is how do we do more to get our farmers in that situation?
I know you've promoted a lot of policies to help farmers transition and get more support because it's expensive, it takes several years, and I'm guessing in the next farm bill that will be another conversation of how to alleviate. Really quickly, because I have one more minute, I want to ask you about the Senate compromise on GMO labeling. For those of you who maybe are not following this issue, the Senate did come up with a bipartisan bill for a very controversial issue, GMO labeling. It would mandate disclosure nationwide, but it could be a QR code on a pack or a symbol or language that says, this contains genetically engineered foods or ingredients. Do you support that compromise, and do you think that it will ultimately be successful through both chambers?
That would it will take a crystal ball to determine whether this will be successful, because there's going to be a lot of opposition from both sides. There'll be one side that says we shouldn't have anything mandatory, and the other side that will say we can't be happy.
It's also an election year, so there's the other factor.
Yeah. I'm reluctant to support it. I'm thrilled that they've moved so far forward, and the fact is, if the QR code is on the label under the current Senate bill, you'll actually automatically know that because there's a QR code, even though you have to read it with your iPhone, that means there's a GMO in it. So it's kind of a tricky little thing, but I also come from a state that was one of the first states to pass GMO labeling, which I want to say was very bipartisan, sponsored by a Republican, passed both chambers, and signed by our very conservative Republican governor. So again, a nonpartisan issue. So I'm going to have some reluctance because it's not going to use the words, and I don't like the idea that you have to have technology to read the QR code. But I will say they have moved very far on this, and kudos to Debbie Stabenow, who's probably lost more sleep than anyone else in Congress over this issue.
I think that's probably
and
true.
More than anything else, I personally would love to see us come to a solution and put it to bed, because we've got a lot of big issues in front of us. And while it's really important to have a GMO label still does not ensure that that is an organic product. So it could be GMO, but it could have pesticides or herbicide residue in it, or a lot of other things that you can't have in organic. And I still think it's important, and I know consumers really want to have that access.
Okay, well, I could talk to you all day, but we have to wrap up, so you can go on to the next session. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Farmers in Congress. We all wish we could be farmers. Seeing the example of somebody who can do as much as Congresswoman Pingree does and happen to be a member of Congress. So inviting to the stage, we have Sam Kass, familiar to all of us at the Institute for frequently coming and enlightening us about what we should be thinking about in terms of food and nutrition policy. He was not only the personal chef to the White House personal chef, but he helped galvanize the national White House.
I wasn't the chef to the chef.
Chef to the chef. Chef to the chef. That's the least of what he did. He, at the White House, established with the First Lady a way of thinking about all of food and physical activity and nutrition and what food producers should be making and how they should be selling it. As the nutrition advisor, food policy head of the Let's Move campaign, which has probably done more to increase public awareness about issues of nutrition, food production, food supply, school food. Has the school food panel already happened?
No, it's after.
Okay, so you have Sam Kass talking with Ann Cooper, the renegade lunch lady.
Right there, right there.
Ann Cooper, the renegade lunch lady. We have an all-star cast at the Aspen Institute and on stage right now. So we have Sam Kass. We have next Jeffrey Dunn. Anyone who read Michael Moss's Salt, Sugar, and Fat will recognize Mr. Dunn as a hero who spent, I don't know how many years at the Coca-Cola Company.
21.
21 years, and then from I think 2008 to 2015 at Bolthouse Farms, he used the marketing skill and savvy that he had developed in his years at Coca-Cola to market baby carrots, and at Bolthouse many kinds of produce that children could use as snacks, that were easily available, that could be as addictive as we would like less nutritious foods to be. Now he is in charge of fresh foods at Campbell. And Campbell is a very progressive company. We have Nestle represented here. We have many progressive companies who have honored the Institute with their presence this week. And we have Walter Robb, the co-CEO of Whole Foods, a company each and every one of us uses, who has spent his decades as a grocer also being an activist, also thinking in terms of changing how food is sold in the country. Welcome you all.
Thank you. So how is everybody? Good? Good. So if I had to pick two people that I could spend all day with and learn from and talk to about how to fix the food system and where do we go from here, it would be these two guys here. I am so honored to be here with you both, and two of the greatest minds we have. So excited to get into some stuff. So the question here is, what's the role of the private sector to fix the broken food system? And just a couple sentences on context. You know, right now we have a system that is rapidly degrading the key inputs that sustain it, namely water and soil. We're seeing a system that's contributing 25% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, second only to energy, and on a trajectory that's going straight up, whereas we see energy we can see the future where emissions from energy are going down, food and ag are going straight through the roof. And we're having outcomes where food is the #1 cause of preventable death and disease in this country, by far. Nothing even close to it. And in the process, as you've heard in the previous panel, we're wasting in this country 40% of the food we produce. So that is, for me, the most inefficient of the major human systems, and producing quite distorted outcomes, particularly when you think about 1 in 6 Americans are food insecure. So I just want to give you each a second to just talk about, generally, considering a lot of these challenges have been driven by the business practices of companies for many decades. How do you see the role of the private sector, of food companies, in solving this?
Okay, well, happy to be here, and thanks, Sam. It's nice to be with you and Walter. So, role of the private sector in fixing the food system. I come at it a different way than most people. I come at it from the standpoint of the private sector is a bunch of human beings who get together in things called companies and decide every day what they're going to do. I see Stuart Resnick out there. Stuart's a friend of ours, a big farmer in California, and the people who run those companies have decisions to make every day about how they're going to orient themselves to what they do. I think the most exciting thing I've seen in the private sector, maybe in my 35 years of doing this, is a whole new generation of leaders growing up who say, not only do I want to make money, making money's great, it's a capitalist country. And capitalism can work for you. But when capitalism is unfettered, which is to some extent the role of the public sector, is to create the corridor, you get unfortunate outcomes. And we've got a whole group of leaders growing up who are saying, you know, I don't accept that binary paradigm anymore. What I want to do is make money, and I want to make money by making people healthy, by giving them great, healthy, fresh, delicious food. And there's been this belief that those things were mutually exclusive, that somehow to make money, you had to give people unhealthy food, and it was hard to make money giving them healthy food. And I will sit here and tell you, the thing that's going to change this food system the fastest is the recognition that we're in the third wave of food. The biggest business opportunity I've seen in the last 35 years is to ride this wave and to be a leader in reframing yourself as a company to take advantage of the changing consumer demands. That's what we're trying to do with a massive transformation of a 150-year-old company called Campbell's. But that's just one node in the network. And so I think it's actually happening right in front of our eyes. And if you don't get on the train, in all due respect, in 10 years, you're going to be Kodak. You're going to be gone because consumers decided they want a different reality.
I mean, the role of the private is to invest, is to create, it's to collaborate, it's to innovate, make new things happen. And I think what's amazing is the number of companies that are now being started by young folks. We have a couple of them out here. I know Alex from Back to the Roots. Raise your hand, Alex. Back to the Roots. They're starting out with the very idea that these things are not in conflict. The idea that you're going to make a profit, that you're going to do good. In fact, the very mission is embedded in the soul of the company, which is incredibly encouraging. And you have a whole generation of customers who are now looking for those sorts of attributes in companies and the products and the services that they purchase. So for us, I mean, obviously we started out with an idea of making a healthier world in whatever way that we could, and we've learned a lot more. And I think what's different now is that we know a lot more. So we know a lot more that we're looking at not just individual ingredients, we're looking at systems of how this food is produced. We've got to look at animal welfare, we've got to look at farm worker welfare, we've got to look at soil, as you mentioned, and health. And we're losing 6 inches of topsoil in the United States every year with the food that we're producing. 6 inches. I mean, and this is not stuff you can recreate. Yeah. And so who's measuring that, and who's measuring when you make a produce purchase, who's measuring how the farmer is managing the soil and so forth? Your question is, I mean, look, I agree with Jeff. The role of the companies is to create and to make things happen, hopefully purpose-based, hopefully values-based. The role of the government is to create some sort of guide rails. That's what's happening with the GMO labeling right now, a debate. And but there's no end to what can be done through if the power of the companies is harnessed in the right direction. Yeah.
So, and we'll talk a lot more about the next generation of companies in a minute. But a lot of what I think these companies are filling is this giant trust gap. And so I want to talk to you about, like, how does the private sector think about food companies, think about rebuilding trust that has been lost? And what's the role of transparency in all that? And how do you think transparency, the force of transparency, is going to play out in this process of sort of reestablishing trust?
Go ahead.
Okay. So big food companies, the trust gap, I think, grew, let's call it over the last 25 years. There's some great writings about trust. Everyone wants more trust in their relationships, but it suggests that trust begins with being trustworthy. It's an inside-out experience. And so I think what large companies have figured out is they need to be more trustworthy, not in the sense of protecting the consumer from food safety. They do a very good job on that, but trustworthy in the sense of being willing to make themselves transparent in the actions they're taking. And the thing, Campbell's was one of the leaders, the first large food company to come out for, GMO labeling nationally, because you can debate GMOs till the sun goes down about whether they're good or bad. But at the end of the day, what was very clear to us is the consumer deserved the right to know. And after we made that move, which was a controversial move, there was a lot of folks who, were on the other side of that issue. We had about 95% positive feedback through social media, people actually writing letters, things on paper and sending to us and thanking us.
Letters on paper.
Letters on paper, incredible, from all over the country and from small towns and big towns. And they said to Denise Morrison, our CEO, thank you. I want someone to stand up for me. I just want to know what's in my food. And I don't think that's too much to ask. So, that's at the heart of it.
Well, what's interesting is that my view is that as companies get larger, their exposure to lack of trust grows. In other words, people generally assume larger companies are up to something, smaller companies are not. And I think that needs to, if we're going to really solve and change the food system, we need all size companies, large, medium, and small, to contribute. Yeah. And they all need to get to a higher level. I mean, we're now a large company. We're $16 billion in sales, and so and we've slipped a couple times. And so trust is a very thin thing, and it's built. It has to be earned through your behavior and your continued behavior, and through your leadership. And we had a couple incidents where that was tested, and people we saw, we didn't lose it entirely, but we had to work to rebuild it, and it's not pleasant. But I think I go back to Jeff's comment about really you have to earn it, and that one way you can earn it is to be 100% transparent. Yeah. Because if you're transparent, you're basically laying out, here's how the food's being produced, here's where we're getting the food. So it is the way the future is going to unfold. Companies are either going to be more transparent. If they're not, I don't think they're going to be successful. They're not going to be around. And so, trust is earned through transparency and continued behavior. Yeah.
So just to put a fine point on the GMO labeling debate, and hopefully we can get past this debate as soon as possible. From my vantage point, I would have preferred, mandatory labeling for everybody along the lines of what Campbell's is doing voluntarily. But we got a bill that seems to have at least 75% of what advocates were pushing for, protecting organic, expanding dramatically what's covered, and mandating disclosure. Seems like a classic Washington compromise. What's your take on, is this a bill that should get passed or not?
I just want to say one more thing in the trust thing, if I could, Sam, which is that trust is also earned by taking big steps or taking big actions. So when a company goes out and puts a stake in the ground around on a particular issue, like Campbell's did on transparency with their first CPG in the country to say we're going to put the on-pack labeling for GMO, voluntarily did it. It was a great leadership step, and I think you built trust in Campbell's as a result of that action. Likewise, some of the things we've done around animal welfare or sustainable seafood, I think when we've taken those steps have built trust. People say, okay, I trust that company is going to try to do the right thing. So it can be earned. It's not a passive thing. It can be earned through your leadership, the steps that you're taking in these different directions. But my view on the bill is that, and I'm pretty intimately aware of it, is that I think it's an incredible thing that Senator Stabenow has put together with Senator Roberts. When you take a look at the atmosphere up there on Capitol Hill, that this much was accomplished together. Whether it passes or not is an open question over the next couple of weeks. The alternative is Vermont goes into effect, and then there's a number of other states behind that. Makes it difficult for manufacturers to be able to label to that different standard. And frankly, the Vermont bill, while the national bill would never have happened if Vermont had not passed. There just wouldn't have been the pressure. It's a very imperfect bill. It doesn't cover a lot of products. There's gaps and inconsistencies that ultimately are probably better addressed through some sort of a national standard. And I think the way she's put the bill together, which is to give manufacturers choices, is I think the marketplace and the customers will take it from here and there. So obviously, I think she's done a great piece of work. We already are out there further with our commitment to full transparency by 2018. And we're looking at how these two live with each other, but we're already past that. But I think in this day and age, to come together to create some sort of a reasonable standard that manufacturers and gives the customers a lot more information is a pretty good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say we're supportive of it from pretty much a practical perspective, which is anytime Washington comes together and actually bipartisan support to get something done, I think we have to support that, because otherwise, that sector of our society is a little strained right now. It's not perfect, but it's progress, not perfection. So I think it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, but the Congresswoman said earlier, she's absolutely right. If we're going to fuss around the next year on this issue, we're going to miss what we really need to do is get onto that farm bill and talk about much bigger things. They're going to take all of our time. That's where we need to get this resolved and move on to the bigger set of
And the
issues.
one thing I'd add, Walter, is that just as companies step out and make a bold step, and the credibility and support that needs to flow from that is really important. The same is true for politicians. So when you have somebody out there sticking their neck out, fighting for something, they get a lot, but not everything. It's incredibly important to support that compromise and support the person who's fighting on your behalf, because, by the way, there's like 12 other really important things to fight, and you need those people feeling like there's a reason to keep on going. And I think in the good food world, we had to do a much better job at being strategic and pragmatic about how we move forward. But I want to change gears a little bit, because as all the work I did in the White House with companies across the spectrum, consistently I ran into CEOs who were trying to do big, bold action, and Wall Street was a perpetual barrier around long-term thinking. So these are big problems that took decades in the making. And it's going to take long-term investment if we're really going to shift companies' practices to the depth that we need to. But long-term thinking is not how a CEO is really incentivized to think. It's quarterly reports and analyst reports, and if you can't show an ROI in a year, maybe 2, it has no real value on Wall Street. So talk to me about how that dynamic affects you, and is there anything you see that we can do to help make a much better environment for CEOs to take leadership on this?
Yeah, we've been public since '93. It's got some great advantages of the liquidity for our team members and a lot of value creation there for them that have helped to build the company. So on balance, Sarbanes-Oxley is a pain in the rear end, but I think being public has been a good thing. But you're right, Wall Street's thing is pretty much what have you done for me lately? And if your stock does slip, it does put a lot of pressure. You've got a lot of shareholders, rightly so, who are legitimate stakeholders. I think somewhere else in this conference, you've got Larry Fink from BlackRock talking about a new view of capitalism and a longer view, time horizon. I think he's really written some terrific stuff about how to start shifting that dialogue and that narrative. And really for us, it hasn't been much of a conflict until the last couple of years. Really, we've been doing our thing, and the share price has responded, and we've lived successfully between the two of them. It's only the last couple of years that there is a lot of pressure on the short-term results. And the problem is if you cave into that and you go for short-term results, you're going to lose your soul, and you're going to ruin the company. So for us, I think we're focused on our purpose, our mission, our reason that we exist as a company, and hopefully our performance improves and we continue to earn the shareholder support and build value over the long term.
Yeah. How about you, Jeff?
Yeah, so having been in public company life about 2/3 of my career and 1/3 in private equity, I like private equity better. Simpler, right? Simpler mission and simpler brief.
But private equity's got its own pressure.
It's got pressure.
You got to get a
There's no
5x
pressures.
return on something.
The difference is you deal with one person instead of a whole range of potential folks who could come into your stock. And activist investing, however you feel about activist investing, creates a lot of turmoil for companies. But bring it back to any individual company. At its heart, it's about long-term shareholder value. I think what gets lost in this conversation is that long-term piece. Many times it comes down to a very short, kind of momentum-oriented view of the market, which boards and CEOs need to resist chasing that tail. Because ultimately what it's going to do is, it's going to pull you into this short-termism in a way that I think is very difficult. And the more dynamic the change environment in the industry you serve, and I would say food right now is pretty dynamic in the change, the more challenging that environment is because you're managing today's business, you're managing for the future. So I do think boards, need to become much more aggressive in creating the conditions for companies to take a longer-term view. But I look at the transformation going on in Campbell's today. We have great board support for what we're doing. It's expensive. We're renovating products. We're moving into businesses like Fresh that have much lower margins today than the legacy businesses. And over time, those margins will improve with scale. But at the heart of it, it's the right thing for us to do because it's where the market is going, and we have to think long term. So I'd say that it's going to continue to be a challenge, but that's what leadership's about, is charting that course through turbulent waters.
Yeah. So Jeff, this question, I have a bunch more questions and we're running out of time, so I want to blow through a couple of them. I wish we had all day. So Jeff, we think about climate change as this problem of the future, and I want to hear from you from just a straight business perspective, how are you thinking about climate change? Is it affecting the business now? When do you see it starting to take hold? And how are you thinking about a strategy to deal with that?
Yeah, so as big farm, we're farmers. We grow about half the carrots with our farming partners that are grown in North America. Anyone who tells you that climate change isn't real, tell them to talk to a farmer. We used to produce 100% of our carrots in California. It's now 60%. We've moved 40% of the production out of California because of the drought, moving into places like Eastern Washington, Canada, and Georgia. That has real economic as well as supply chain implications to us. So, at the heart of this, climate change is really affecting kind of the base commodities, what you can grow, where you can grow it, and technology is helping there. But I think we have to recognize that if, the impact of climate change is going to force a real shift in where we grow and how we grow. And the only thing that gives me hope is technology's coming that's allowing us to be really precise in how we farm, which will also help us identify the regions as we shift growing across the country. But it's a big issue, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Yeah.
And in a competitive world, it's not just competitive in the retail stores, it's competitive on the supply chain. And we're working 2 to 5 years out securing supply. You mentioned there's some organic shortages. It's true, black beans, for example. And so you have to be way upstream. And as you're talking to producers about it, they're realizing these effects exactly what Jeff said, which is that they're having to move acres and they're having to make adjustments. And it's going to be, part of this is they're dealing with these very changes. So it affects us in terms of where we're going to be able to get this stuff to be able to sell. So.
Yeah. And food just sits in such an interesting place because it's not only on the front lines of impact, but it's also the front lines of communication. People are going to start feeling the effects through food first, and I think there's an interesting role for the food industry to play in actually galvanizing support for this.
And go back to the Farm Bill. I think as we think about the next Farm Bill, Sam and I debate this over scotch late at night sometimes. I think we need to think about it differently. I think we need to think about it in a much more longer-term horizon, and how do we get ready for the conditions that are coming at us, both as we shift from conventional to organic, we think about soil health, but also how do we create a food system that really provides health to our people as a primary objective beyond profit? Because, if we don't have a healthy society, everything else really comes into question, and ask the military about how healthy our society is today.
Yeah. So just to put a point of clarity, we discuss that, we don't debate that point. I am fully in agreement.
Everybody knows that when you produce food organically, those of you who garden know that you're fixing carbon in the soil, and there's a lot of exciting things happening in sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture that are actually reversing the carbon. The thing is, it's just happening, so quickly. So.
And our friends at Back to the Roots just launched their first biodynamic product, so way to go, boys. Awesome.
I want to just underline one point you made, this pivot from this idea of health is the absence to the health of the presence of. Health is vitality. It's something that everybody deserves a shot at, and it comes primarily from your diet and healthy food in whatever form you put it together. But that is really the purpose of the food system, is to create vitality, sustainable vitality, not just the absence of sickness and I think, so to do that, ultimately the food system is going to need to think more holistically, more systems-wide in terms of soil, health, farm worker, all the components that produce the food. We're going to have to come to terms with the fact that these things are all involved. It costs a little more to do that, or work on scale to bring it down, and deal with the disparities of access that exist right now in the world around access to fresh, healthy food.
Well, I think it's a question of where we pay it. We're going to pay it somewhere, either in our healthcare system or in the cost of food, either dealing with the environmental fallout. The costs are there. It's just where are they getting externalized?
Healthcare is now almost 20% of the GDP in this country. Right. It's a huge amount of money, and 80% of it's preventable. Yeah. 80%. Just from an economics perspective, you think crazy. People would pivot into the power of food.
So I want to close with a final question, and I think it's a place that all three of us are spending a lot of our time thinking about. And it's the dynamic that's playing, we referenced it, about this generation of entrepreneurs that are taking the lead, that are founding businesses to solve these problems, and the interplay with technology. And technology in food is complicated, right? I mean, we have this sensibility about natural and our food, where it comes from, and how it should feel to us emotionally. And technology can have a complicated role there. But so what do you guys see systemically and the dynamic of all these young entrepreneurs with technology, the role they're going to play, and what is that doing to the rest of the system? So how does, say, a Campbell's or a Whole Foods, the pressures and the dynamics that's playing out throughout the system?
Look, I say this all the time, that I think many of the creative solutions are going to come out of the entrepreneurial sector of society. They're just generally, there was a great talk earlier today about the nonconformists. They're a bit of the nonconformists who can think differently. I think many large companies, through venture arms and other things they're doing, are trying to tap into that. And if you can enable this generation of entrepreneurs, I think they will pull the large companies with them, because they'll be able to take risks and have a horizon of risk that's very different than a large company. So, if we want a healthy food system, I think one of the things we can all do is support these entrepreneurial companies. However, and it's not just product companies, it's technology companies, information companies, people who are de-aggregating the food system and putting it back together in really different ways, many of them using the digital technology. So I think that gives me a lot of optimism about the potential.
I think technology is the wrong word. I think technology is really just a word for capability, because it allows companies to serve their customers, serve each other, serve communities in different ways than they can do right now. But ultimately for us, we're going to partner with, buy, take for example Instacart. We could never have gotten to market with a last mile delivery in 5 years. The CapEx investment alone would have been huge. We partnered with Instacart, this young startup out of San Francisco, and we're in business in 1 month. And these companies and these young entrepreneurs have this mindset of constant innovation and evolution. I see a poor, he's got 10 data scientists. He's taking the data in real time. He's adjusting and make adjustments. It's incredibly powerful to see, if you've been running a business for a while, like how quickly they're able to change. And so we're going to partner with, invest in, buy in some cases, learn from these companies who are helping to accelerate through the beneficial use of technology, the changes that that we're talking about here today.
Yeah. Well, I've gotten the 0 sign a while back, but I wish we could keep going. There's so many more important issues to tackle. But guys, thank you so much for your leadership and your time.
Thank you.
Okay, so after we will move now to the much more personal, the much more activist, the much more how we can all get involved section of the program. I love that we have our leaders in the first row, because after a 20-minute conversation, we're going to come back and I'll be fielding questions for everybody, who will all have a mic, and they'll be fighting over the mic. They'll each have something to say about every single question. Right now, we've got two of my favorite activists, and Navina, I just had the pleasure of meeting here.
I'm already your favorite? Wow.
Well, considering how eloquently and powerfully you spoke this morning.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, indeed you are. We were speaking about food safety and extending that to worker safety, because indeed Navina Khanna specializes in and has spent her life gathering together farm workers, agriculture workers of all kinds, and thinking of food justice in its largest terms, and the largest number of people who are working to bring us the food that we eat and we buy all the time. How are they being treated? What do we need to think about in spending our food dollars as to how the people who produced our food have been treated, and who makes and what's behind all the food that we buy? And then nobody is smarter than Urvashi Rangan, except some of the people in this room, but just because we have such smart people here today. Urvashi, well, she's a PhD, so after all, she's intimidating. She's the Director of Consumer Safety and Sustainability at Consumers Union. But when there's an issue to do with labeling, antibiotics in food, there's a wide range of things that I'm often confused about, my colleagues are confused about, and we turn to Urvashi for clear, straight answers. And so we'll be hearing some of that in their conversation now.
Thanks a lot, Corby, and thank you. We're excited to be here today and to kind of finish off this session and talk a little bit about what Corby alluded to, which is the connection between so many different aspects of sustainability. We throw that word around a lot. It evolves over time. It's not a static word. It's something that as we learn more, we add to that. And as sort of we grow in our understanding and we try to pull the top up, we're trying to pull the bottom up with it. And there's lots of examples of that. And so animal welfare, fairness to workers, protecting the environment, these are all aspects of sustainability. And what you see on the screen right now is one of the results of a national poll that we've done at Consumer Reports, we run a lot of them, we're like the Gallup poll and all sorts of things, and we can take the pulse, the national pulse of people. What we've learned over time is people are learning more and more about sustainability. They care more and more about how their food's produced, and they care about it not just in how it means to them and their health. They also care about it in terms of supporting local farmers or worker welfare, making sure workers are healthy or that animals are healthy. And we like to sort of broaden the meaning of a healthy food to a healthier food production system. And I like to use that sort of interchangeably with sustainability. And those are the aspects that both Navina and I have really dedicated our careers to, and making those connections between those things and trying to educate consumers and really mobilize them to create demand for a better marketplace, and then to work on those longer term changes, which are the policy changes, which take a little bit longer over time to get done. So with that, we're going to sort of have a conversation between the two of us and the work we've been doing. I come at it as a scientist, running our testing at Consumer Reports, doing advocacy work. I sit on the FDA Food Advisory Committee, and tying food safety and public health back to food sustainability. Navina comes at it from more of a grassroots point of view and from more direct organization. And so Navina, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work, how you do it, and we'll take it from there.
Sure, I can start, and definitely looking forward to hearing more about yours too. So I'm actually really happy that this whole conversation has been happening this afternoon. I think it's been pretty incredible to hear from people from so many different vantage points, big business and policymakers and organizers and advocates who are all trying to achieve the same goal, right? And most of my work is around, thinking about how do we build the strongest and most strategic movement that can actually transform the food system. And we know that that kind of transformation requires all of our best skills, all of our resources, all of us coming together to actually make the kinds of changes that we want. And the title of this panel is how do we fix our broken food system, or something like that.
Easy.
Yeah, piece of cake, silver bullet. I think one of the things that I would premise is that the organization that I'm the director of, the Heal Food Alliance, and I'll talk more about it, we would argue that the food system that we have today actually isn't broken, that it's actually doing exactly what it was designed to do. That if you look back through history and you look at the impacts of what's happened over time today, that the system benefits a few and not everyone, right? So if we even think about ourselves here and the wonderful things that we've had access to, I was just outside and saw these beautiful cherries and the kale and the kimchi and the chocolate and all of these things that are coming from all over the place that we're able to eat here, which is wonderful and beautiful. And I'm really excited to go out there and eat that after this panel. But of course, it requires that we have the power and the resources to do that. The reality is, when we look across history, that much of what our food system is built on is on the forced migration of people, forced labor, stolen land, and that continued today through exploitation, particularly of workers, but it also shows up in who has access to land and who actually can farm, who has access to capital to be able to start a business, who has access to voting rights and being able to actually elect a policymaker who will make good decisions on behalf of them. So there are a number of impacts that we can see if we look throughout history. And again, how they show up today in our food system. Urvashi and I will both talk a little bit about food workers, and one of the things that we'll point out is that there are 20 million people that work in our food system right now, and 5 of the 8 worst paying jobs in our country are food system jobs. And that is a continuation of the same exploitation that we've seen throughout history. We're seeing that continue today across from the places that our food is procured from, how it's produced, how it's prepared, shared, sold, served, who cleans up after us, all of those things. And at the same time, 20 million people who are working in the food system, 50 million people in the US don't have access to enough food to eat. They are people who would be considered food insecure. And those food workers are actually 1.5 times more likely to be dependent on food assistance than other folks. So if we think about where we need to organize and where we need to build power from, the way that we think about it is that we need to build from the front lines, right? People who are most impacted by what we're calling our broken food system, right? But folks who are most negatively impacted by our current food system are also at the forefront of the solutions. And so HEAL stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, Labor, Food Alliance. And we started from the premise that no single organization, no single sector, no one mindset is going to be able to solve all of the problems, that it actually is going to take all of us, that we need to build all of our power and align together to make the change that we want. And that this was mentioned in the last panel. It's great to hear people from big business saying this, but that we need to move away from the mindset where profit is considered more valuable than life, right? That putting profit over people or the planet just is not sustainable, and that if we're going to change things, we need to get out of this mindset and this mythology that profit is more sacred. The HEAL was started by a small group of anchor organizations. So it was the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which represents 23 member-based organizations around the country and 250,000 workers in different sectors. The Union of Concerned Scientists, some of you may have heard Ricardo Salvador speaking earlier today. The Real Food Generation, which organizes college students around the country, and the Movement Strategy Center, where I've been housed. Organizations coming together along with many other farmer organizations and worker organizations and so on, really, with this idea that we need to get beyond our single issues and build power together in a few different areas. So I know I only have about 1 minute left, but I'll just share real briefly the ways that we're organizing so that we can hopefully get into more conversation about this later. One of them is thinking about what's actually happening in communities and how do we affect change in communities, multiple communities at the same time. So what we're calling translocal organizing. And our current campaign on that is passing procurement policy that models what Los Angeles has already done, that requires that any municipal dollars that are going towards food purchases only go to places that meet certain labor standards, environmental standards, animal welfare standards, are local and regional, and so on. San Francisco Unified School District recently passed it, and we're trying to pass it in about 4 more cities right now. We're also looking at how can we really take on the policies that allow big corporations, most big corporations, there are of course exceptions, but that allow big corporations to get away with setting standards that allow them to just hold so much power that doesn't even allow consumers or workers to have any decision-making power in the food system. So thinking about the kinds of mergers that are happening and consolidation that's happening that's affecting all of us. So that's one area that we're looking at, that runaway corporate control. And then the third is really thinking about political leadership. And we already heard from Representative Chellie Pingree earlier, and she's really been a champion for all of us. But thinking about, this current administration has already done so much for us in helping us see what our federal government could do for us in terms of thinking about our food system, but really calling on candidates in this current election cycle, in this current presidential campaign to take on food system, the same way that they're talking about things like education and immigration and hopefully climate change and so on, that they talk about food issues too. So our current campaign is, we're calling it Plate of the Union, and really trying to call on those candidates to think about food too. So 3 areas. And I'll leave it there.
Great.
And then turn it to you to share a little bit about how you approach the work.
Thank you, Navina. It's all very interesting. And, it's going to take, I think, different approaches in the food movement to get these solutions in place. At Consumer Reports, we don't just test toasters and cars, we test a lot of food as well. And we have about 8 million subscribers, and we're really dealing with people who are in the middle of the country, don't know a lot about sustainable food systems maybe, and really trying to convert the mass market over. And we have an approach, we have a tone, and we have really a philosophy behind our work and how we do it, so that we can see the changes we want to see in the food movement. And our goal is to move things in a more sustainable direction. As the head of our food safety testing department and sustainability, I try to marry those concepts together all the time. And we've done a lot of projects over the last couple of years. We've tested ground beef and the safety of ground beef, chicken, shrimp, turkey, pork, arsenic in rice, arsenic in juice, pesticides in produce. And on all of those issues, it seems like you're reading a story about one product and one contaminant, but the goal is really to build the prism and the dimension around that includes a lot of the principles that we're talking about. So in a lot of cases, we like to talk about like in pesticides in produce, how are the workers treated? How do we know why pesticides can be harmful? Why do we know some of them are carcinogens or neurotoxins? The unfortunate answer is it's often the workers and their families, and that's how we've actually identified those things. In beef, for example, we divided our sample pool into grass-fed beef that was produced sustainably and organic and beef without antibiotics, and compared that to the conventional pool, and we found some really fascinating results. The more sustainable pool has less E. coli, less Staphylococcus, and less multi-drug resistant bacteria. And by putting that scientific underpinning behind what a lot of us know is right to do, or a grass-fed diet is a more natural diet for an animal is certainly healthier with that diet, we can actually now put the scientific proof out there that there's even a connection to the safety of the food that we're eating. And there's even a connection to the safety of the workers and the amount of drugs we're using on the farm, and workers who are close to the animals getting drug-resistant diseases, and even being able to type that at the genetic level. By making those connections, we hope to educate people in a much bigger way and change and shift demand in the short term by telling people which labels to look for and which labels not to look for, so that we can create true demand in the short term while hammering in Washington to create the longer term changes that we need in the longer term. Mm-hmm. So that's really our philosophy, and I'd encourage anyone to go to greenerchoices.org, where we put out really big reports in addition to our magazine stories that try to tie all of these elements together, and then we hope that we can hand this to people on the Hill in Washington, to anyone who's trying to understand how to make the case for change, because you need that scientific grounding out there to really make the most compelling case.
And Urvashi, I know you've done work on looking at how consumers react to things too. Like, what can you say about how consumers care?
Yeah, thanks, Navina. If we'd put up just the next slide, please. This is another one of our results from our surveys. So we can't test worker justice, for example. We know that we believe that workers should be treated fairly. We know there are label programs that actually ensure that. But what's really interesting is we can actually gauge how much more willing a consumer is to pay. And this slide was astonishing to us, and actually it was the same result this year as it was 2 years ago, which is that 80% of people will pay more. And if you look, of that 80%, 10% are willing to pay $1 or more per pound for produce for workers that are treated better and more fairly. This is the kind of data we take out there. We take it to Washington. We publish it in our reports because we want people to have this. This is powerful information. And our policymakers need to know this, because this is what consumer demand is. And this is how we're going to start to see the supply shift to match the demand. Mm-hmm. Navina, tell us a little bit, and we're really running at the end of this. Food chains, the movie brought out a lot of really interesting aspects. And one of them that I was struck by was that supermarkets felt very dissociated from the farm workers in terms of fairness, fighting for their fairness and for fair wage and for health treatment. And there was a real disconnect in the movie showing supermarkets saying, well, they don't work for us, they're part of the distribution system. The next thing I was really astonished by, though, was the consolidation in the supermarket industry. Can you tell us, for all the supermarkets out there in the country, how many companies are running about 90% of those, and how does that affect your work?
Yeah, I think we're at about 5 corporations that are controlling supermarkets across the country. We can
5.
five with supermarkets. We can say something similar with the beef industry. It's 4 corporations that are controlling
Chicken,
most of that,
too?
right? We're seeing more and more consolidation and more mergers.
So does that make it easier to target? It somehow seems it might be, or does it make it harder to get the change that we want to see?
You know, I think that it definitely makes it more challenging, is what I would say. And I think, you know, from our perspective, we're not trying to target a specific corporation and change their behavior necessarily. I think that that's been a great approach for a lot of groups, including the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who are featured in that film Food Chains, that if you haven't seen it, everybody please check it out. Really, really wonderful film. But what we really want to see is policy change that makes a standard for corporations to treat their workers well, to treat the environment well, to actually support small farmers, to actually make it possible for us all to have access to healthy, affordable food in our communities, right? We want to see that it's not just about these 1 or 2 companies that are both, or 5 companies in some cases, that are writing the rules and controlling every aspect of the system, but that we actually, as consumers, have a choice when we're going places, and that the healthy choice is the easy choice for all of us, that the fair choice is the easy choice for all of us.
And that's our snippet. We are out of time. Thank you very much.
Hey, yeah, thanks. I'd like to start with the affordability of food. It's something that doesn't seem to have been discussed really at all. But we have food deserts across the country. We don't have really access to food. And before we even talk about the profitability in the private sector, should we at least have a conversation about who are the consumers who are interested in this kind of food? Because some consumers just want access to food, period. So how do we make good food affordable, and do we need to, is that part of looking at the Farm Bill, do we need to subsidize different types of crops, different types of food in order to achieve that? Or is that something that the private sector can do without congressional support?
I think that's a question on the minds of all of our panelists, and we're going to have Walter and Sam.
I might want to jump in.
And Navina.
Maybe.
Well, Walter's insisting that I go first, Corby. Is that okay?
It's always okay.
Okay. I need permission from you, though. I know how this place works. Look, it's the right question. It's a super complicated, tough question, and I think the answers are going to be multifaceted. We did a lot of work at the White House on this. We invested hundreds of millions of dollars in trying to incentivize grocery stores to open up in lower-income communities, and Walter can speak to that. I think when I look at it, it's a giant market failure and a big opportunity. I mean, these are people in communities that don't have access. So there's different levels of this. The most egregious are communities where people are shopping in grocery store, in gas stations and liquor stores for food. Those are people who have money and need better food. And I think it's going to be a combination of new grocery models, which I think Walter talked about, but also delivery systems where you're boxing up produce and getting it right to the community where you need, where you're not paying for the brick and mortar. So there's like the delivery and retail part, but I'll leave that alone. I think the other side of it is how we produce and what we're producing. I think the notion that subsidies would be the answer is not a practical one, particularly because the people in Washington who fight against subsidies are the fruit and vegetable growers themselves. They like being the only ones who are growing fruits and vegetables. And so when the constituency that's going to be the one that would benefit is fighting against, you're not going to get very far. I think the part of the answer that gets no attention that would be have the biggest impact is on research. The reason why there's the biggest disparity between the cost of processed food and corn and soy essentially versus specialty crops is that for 60 years we've been pouring tens and tens of billions of dollars into figuring out how to grow those crops really efficiently, and we've put no money into fruit and vegetables and how to make it possible for us to grow them in a much more efficient way. So it's going to be a combination from, I think, how we fund research and how we grow that food all the way through to how it's distributed. So I'll give the distribution piece to you.
But it's a really important question because it does get to what's the value of food, right? It's never about price; it's about value, but there's many ways this is being gone at. In many communities, they are empowering themselves through gardening, through other efforts where they're producing their own food and they're having access in that respect. I mean, Detroit is a wonderful model that way. You know, that's got the largest number of urban gardens in the United States in that particular city. For us, I mean, we're trying to close that gap between the quality of the food and the affordability, accessibility of the food, and we're trying to do our part through building stores in inner city. We've built 4. We have another one opening in the south side of Chicago on the 8th of September, and this is a community that has an average income of about $21,000. So we're really stretching to address that question squarely on. And what you find when you dig in there is you've got a lot of food that's being produced. It's a lot of calories. It doesn't have a lot of nutrition in it. And actually, the foods that are the most nutrient dense in the world are fruits and vegetables. Sam pointed out from a policy perspective, they've not been supported in the Farm Bill with any sort of support in terms of those production of fruits and vegetables. But fruits and vegetables, particularly conventionally grown, are eminently affordable, and they're nutrient dense. They're powerful foods. And so some of it is around remaking the diet in different ways that are culturally appropriate. There's so many ways we could go with your question. Certainly it matters. I think what matters is the calibration between the affordability, the accessibility, and the quality, so that it's not a race to the bottom with food that's got lots of calories but doesn't have a lot of nutrition and a lot of ability to help improve people's lives. And in my, just want to say, in my conversation,
very quickly.
Yeah.
oh, okay. I would just say in my conversations with, you say who are, in my conversations in Baltimore, in Detroit, in Chicago, what I'm told, what they're telling me is that we want access to the same choices as everybody else has. We don't want some subset sort of choices. We want the actual same choices. That's what we want.
I just want to make the point that I think it's really important for us not to conflate access with affordability. Just because food is accessible in a neighborhood doesn't mean that people can afford it. And when we're having the conversation about affordability, we have to absolutely talk about wages at the same time, right? The reason why people can't afford food is because they don't make enough money to be able to afford that food. If you look across the food system just itself, again, 10 million people working in the restaurant industry, the majority of those are making only $2.13 an hour because of frozen wages. That goes across the board in the food system, that 5 of the 8 worst paying jobs are food system jobs. And again, just looking at what poverty line is, what minimum wage is, of course, it's starting to raise in certain cities across the country. Some states are starting to do the same thing, but we absolutely need to be calling for an increase of the minimum wage for everyone so that everyone can make those choices to afford good food.
Great, thank you. Next question.
My name is Miguel Blancarte Jr. I am from the southwest side of Chicago, and after embarking on a healthy lifestyle change where I was able to lose 180 pounds in 8 months via healthy eating and exercise, I realized the importance of healthy eating, coming from an underserved community, the Little Village, Pilsen neighborhoods in Chicago, my parents were immigrants. They didn't earn a lot of money, and they didn't always have a lot of time to necessarily maybe make the better decisions on what they buy. So what I've been contemplating now, and I don't know if maybe you all have thought of this or if it's something that's been kind of broiling, but what if we use students? Because now I'm focusing on students and children and teaching them the importance of healthy eating and exercise. I mean, the USOC reached out to me about joining Team USA, and this has been a terrific feat for me after never being physically capable whatsoever. But the fact that we can potentially involve students with teaching them after school programs, teaching them so that they can go teach their parents once they get home. Mom, this is what I learned. Bringing the sales paper, for example, this is the food here that's available.
It's something we all very much believe in, and Sam is going to be talking about at the next panel, and it looks like we've got Jeff Dunn.
Yeah. There's a couple things we can do today to make that a reality, and I think the science is getting pretty clear. It's about 80% diet, the rest of it's exercise, which is important, and I think some in the food system have tried to obfuscate that fact. So Sam worked very hard with the First Lady to get a school lunch nutrition program passed, been very controversial, a lot of people fighting it. I think one thing we can do is be supportive of that program. It takes time to retrain these kids' palates. One thing I've seen, I've been in a lot of schools with Sam's and others, who put in school gardens in very underserved communities, and the most amazing thing happened. It's like magic. A kid grows a tomato. Maybe they've never had a tomato in their life. They certainly never grew one, and they grow it and they take it home, and they start a conversation with their parents about what they're eating. This is a very straightforward kind of thing we can do today. And, some of the folks who fought that program, I think they're fighting it because their short-term corporate interests, in this case, are aligned with not changing the food system, especially in schools. We should allocate more money to school lunches because it's a place we can educate kids. We can give them maybe sometimes the only nutritious meal they get during the day, and it'll cost a lot less than the next aircraft carrier.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Simone Friedman from EJF Philanthropies in Washington, D.C. And I was just curious. I know that you were saying that a lot of the changes that are happening are really driven by consumer demand, and specifically relating to animal welfare standards or better living conditions for animal welfare. I'm wondering actually if Walter and Jeff could comment about the market opportunities for products that actually do reflect those kinds of values.
Great, thanks. Urvashi and then Walter.
Yeah, I'll just from a philosophical point of view and a scientific one, we know that animal welfare sounds like a lot to people is that PETA, is that veganism, and it's not. And tying animal welfare to safety has been a really interesting journey, even for me, even within our organization. And it's a concept that's difficult to understand, but it's not once you really dig into that. So if you crammed a bunch of us together into a room, like most animals are crammed together, and gave us no space, we would start, someone would get a cold, then the next person would get a cold, we'd all start, we'd all have the cold very quickly because disease spreads when people are crammed together. So there's one aspect of animal welfare. And then you have to use drugs because you have a higher disease rate, and it's sort of this race to the bottom. And we've been trying to elevate those into connecting them to food safety through our testing and those types of things to really demonstrate not only do you get better quality, but you get a safer and healthier product in the end, and the animal is safer and healthier too. We would never feed humans antibiotics on a daily basis to keep them healthy. You'd never do that. And so why in the world do we do that in an animal system? And so kind of bringing those things to the fore we think are incredibly important to creating more demand for that.
We built the whole meat department on a set of standards. One example is the amount of time cattle travel in the conventional beef industry to get to market, or the way that they kill them. I don't know if you've ever been in a cattle kill room, but they actually say, the scientists say that actually translates into the quality of the meat.
Yeah.
So there's, beyond just doing the right thing by the animals, you're going to get a better tasting product, a healthier product. And so that's what our customers have valued. And we've seen that in our system, we've seen our growers actually go from step 1, which is the lowest standard, up to step 4. We have almost 60% of the beef now is pasture raised. In our system, which has happened in just 3 or 4 years. It's really surprised me how quickly the customers have supported that change.
I think the other thing that's happening, and for those of you who don't get to Silicon Valley much, there's a huge food and ag tech movement going on there. There's some incredible companies, Impossible Foods, who've made plant-based hamburger basically that bleeds, sizzles. It's incredible. I've had it. This is
Tomorrow
kind of
we have Patrick Brown coming tomorrow morning at 10:30 to talk about exactly that.
Incredible
along with Ethan
entrepreneur.
Brown of Beyond Meat.
But I think the point being, if you can have the same experience with it being plant-based, I think one of the things we're going to see over the next 10 years is an explosion of plant-based diet generally, and technology taking plants and transforming them into maybe more familiar forms. And I think that's good for the environment, it's good for animals, and ultimately I think it's going to be good for people's health.
Great, we have time for one more question. Gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Raghav from India. I work with tribal and women farmers to set up producer companies, which are enterprises owned by farmers. So my question is about a possible solution at the intersection of both enterprise and activism, in the sense of how can you see the role of farmers really going up from just farming to actually owning, influencing production systems, and all the way up till the policy level. There is a school of thought that says the role of the farmer must be limited just to the farm, and I see that to be the start of a really big problem in the whole production system. Thank you.
So the role of the farmer is definitely not limited to the farm. And what you see right now is there's certain parts of the system, at least in the United States, who are very engaged in policymaking and have a huge influence on policies that govern how they do business, largely to their benefit. I think what you're seeing now is, for the first time, basically in the history of the United States, an upsurge in farmers. So basically, since the beginning of the country, we've seen a decline in farmers. And we now have like 1% of the country's farming. But you're seeing this first uptick largely driven by direct market sales and farmers markets. Companies like Whole Foods are really looking to support small farmers. And we're feeling so good about that for ourselves. That's just not good enough. What we've seen is the decimation of the mid-sized farmer, which is where you see the real power in transforming our food system. And I think it's up to us to empower those farmers to help advocate for policies that are going to help them grow to get some real scale. Because this isn't going to matter unless it's for everybody. And right now, we've done a good job at figuring this out, largely for elites, as we figure out these new models, new ways of doing business. But now the question is, how do we bring it to scale? And the only way it's going to come to scale is if farmers, but not just farmers, it's also chefs and consumers, because I think the one big part we talk about, sustainable agriculture and climate-smart agriculture, is never going to happen unless you have sustainable eating and climate-smart eating. Farmers aren't growing food just for the ether, right? They're growing food for people to eat it. And it's empowering both on the consumer side and the chefs and the farmer side to say, we have a bigger stake in this and our voices need to be heard. And that's definitely starting. But we have to really be conscious and deliberate and strategic about how we elevate that in the years to come, because there's a lot of momentum.
And just speaking about being strategic about it, we have a lot of coalitions in this country. We participate in the National Organic Coalition, where farmers, certifiers, retailers, co-ops, consumer groups, when you can bring that kind of group together at the table, you have far more influence in Washington to get the job done, because you can show economic viability, consumer demand, and prove that that is the right way to go. And that has proven over and over again to be a very powerful way to go.
Well, thank you all. We're at the 0-minute point. And indeed, go on to the website of HEAL, because Navina is bringing together many of these same people. And Urvashi has given me the perfect way of saying the Aspen Institute Food and Society program will bring together people just to talk about and solve these pressing issues that have real potential for progress. So I invite all of you to come tell me what we need to solve, and all of you to come back, help solve them, and all of you to go back in about 5 seconds. At 3 o'clock, there's going to be a conversation between Sam, Helena, and Ann Cooper about school lunch I know you'll want to hear. And then at 4 o'clock, a great talk on heirloom wheats and why is bread so white from Stephen Jones, whom I can't wait to meet, because we all get to meet each other at Aspen. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks.